You're standing in a room full of people you've known for years. Everyone is laughing at something. You laugh too, half a beat behind, the way you always do when you're not quite sure what part of the joke landed. Nobody notices. Nobody would guess that a small, familiar thought just passed through you. I'm here, but I'm not really here. Not lonely exactly. There are people all around you. Someone could reach out and touch your shoulder right now. And still, somewhere behind your eyes, there's a pane of glass between you and the room. This isn't a story about being excluded. Nobody left you out of anything. You were invited, you showed up, you belong here. On paper. So why does some part of you feel like a guest at a party you've technically been attending your whole life? Most people assume this feeling means something is wrong with them. Too sensitive. Too different. Too much, or not enough depending on the day. But there's an older, quieter explanation, and it has almost nothing to do with what's wrong with you. Psychologists who study belongingness make a distinction that most of us never learned growing up. There's a difference between being socially accepted and feeling genuinely understood. You can have both. You can have one without the other. And it's entirely possible to be surrounded by people, welcomed by people, even liked by people, while still not feeling known by any of them. Acceptance is about whether you're allowed in the room. Belonging is about whether the room reflects something true about you. You can pass the first test for years and still fail the second one quietly every single day. Here's where it usually starts. Think back to being young, in whatever room shaped you first. A classroom, a family dinner table, a friend group that had already decided long before you arrived what counted as normal, funny, acceptable, worth noticing. If the things that came naturally to you weren't the things that room valued, you learned something early without anyone saying it directly. You learned to translate yourself. You learned which parts to bring forward and which parts to quietly put away before anyone could react to them. That's not weakness, that's adaptation. Every child does some version of it. But for some people, the gap between who I actually am and who this room wants me to be was wider than for others, and that gap doesn't close just because you grow up and change rooms. There's a concept called social identity theory, which describes how much of our sense of self gets built from the groups we belong to. We don't just join groups, we borrow identity from them. We start to see ourselves partly through the reflection the group gives back. If the group's reflection never quite matched what was actually there, something strange happens. You keep showing up, you keep participating. But a version of you stays slightly hidden because the room was never built to hold that version in the first place. This is why the outsider feeling so often has nothing to do with how many friends you have, how busy your calendar is, or how welcoming the people around you actually are. Plenty of warm, well-meaning people can still, without meaning to, build a room that only fits certain kinds of people comfortably. And you can sense that mismatch long before you can explain it. Here's the part that tends to surprise people. The feeling of being an outsider isn't only about not fitting a group. Sometimes it's about not fitting the self you were handed early on, the one built out of other people's comfort rather than your own nature. There's a difference between "I don't fit in here" and "I was never given a room built for who I actually am." The first feels like a personal failing. The second is simply a fact about circumstance, one that says nothing about your worth and everything about the mismatch between you and your surroundings. Attachment research adds another layer here. Children whose early environments were inconsistent or unable to reflect their emotional experience accurately often grow into adults who feel a subtle disconnect in almost every room they enter later, even good ones. Not because those later rooms are unsafe, but because the nervous system learned very early that being fully seen wasn't reliably available, so it quietly stopped expecting it. That expectation doesn't announce itself. It just shows up as a low, persistent sense that something is slightly off, even in rooms full of people who like you. This is worth sitting with for a moment. The outsider feeling is rarely a verdict on your character. It's frequently a residue, something carried forward from rooms that shaped you before you had any say in the matter, replayed quietly in rooms that may have nothing to do with those original ones at all. There's a version of this that shows up in self-concept research too. The self isn't something you simply discover fully formed. It's something built partly out of the feedback you receive from the people around you as you grow. Praise, dismissal, curiosity, boredom, all of it accumulates. And over time, you start to believe the parts of yourself that got reflected back clearly, while the parts that never got a reaction start to feel less real, even to you. So if certain interests, certain instincts, certain ways of moving through the world never got mirrored back by anyone in your early rooms, it isn't surprising that those parts of you still feel slightly unclaimed, even now, even in rooms full of people who would probably welcome them if you let them show. That's often the quiet cost of learning to translate yourself early. You get very good at being legible to a room. You get much less practice at simply existing in one without editing and seeing what happens. Which raises an uncomfortable but useful question. How much of what you currently interpret as something is wrong with me is actually something was missing from where I started? Those are very different problems. One asks you to fix yourself. The other simply asks you to notice what you never received and to stop mistaking its absence for evidence against you. Here's the quieter, more difficult truth underneath all of this. Feeling different was never proof that something is wrong with you. Sometimes it was only ever proof that your environment never reflected who you actually are and had no way of teaching you that the mismatch belonged to the room, not to you. This doesn't mean every room you're in now is wrong for you. Some genuinely are. But some are simply rooms you've never fully let see you. Because an earlier room taught you, long ago, that showing the whole picture wasn't safe or welcome. It's worth noticing the difference between the two because they call for different responses. A room that's genuinely wrong for you, no amount of openness will fix. And the honest move there is usually to leave, and eventually without turning it into a referendum on your worth. But a room you've simply never let see you calls for something else entirely. It calls for a small, uncomfortable experiment. Showing one true, untranslated piece of yourself and watching what actually happens instead of assuming you already know. Sometimes the room surprises you, sometimes it doesn't. Either way, you learn something you couldn't have learned by staying carefully hidden and guessing forever. The feeling doesn't disappear the moment you understand where it came from, but it does change shape. It stops being a verdict and starts being a fact about your history, when you're finally old enough to examine instead of simply absorb. Maybe the goal was never to finally fit perfectly into every room you enter. Maybe it was to notice which rooms were actually built with space for you, and to stop mistaking every other room's limits for your own.